Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. Thank you for being with us again. If you're watching this in the future, it's because Josiah, my co-host, is out this week. So once again, this is a pre-recorded episode, and we're going to be talking about a very important subject today. This is let me reintroduce myself. My name is Sebastian Para. I'm the co-host of this podcast with my colleague Josiah. How you doing, Josiah?
I'm doing very well. Doing very well.
So of course you're here in the past when we're recording this episode, but in the future, you might not be available this week because
Well, the hope is that if I'm not in the office this week, it's because I've just had a baby. So that's the reason why we're pre-recording this episode, just in case I have to miss recording this week.
yes, so that's our hope, our prayer. We pray that your baby will be healthy and that you and mom and everybody will be fine. So we're excited for that. So in the meantime, this is going to be our first special episode of many that we hope to make. Today's subject is a very important one. We're going to be talking about a particular kind of anti-Semitism. We're going to be talking about right-wing anti-Semitism. Why is this phenomena so interesting? What are some key examples of this? What does it look like? And what are some potential causes? What makes conservative people on the right embrace anti-Semitic labels and Jewish hatred in general? We will eventually release more episodes about this. This is a big, big subject. So we're going to start unpacking it today. We're going to set the table so we can build upon it. So let's get started because, people seem to think that right wing anti Semitism is a new trend. It's like a new trend that some people on the right, conservative people, that would actually people who in the recent past, have been pro-Israel, have said nice things about Israel, said nice things about Jewish people. It seems like it's a new trend of them going down the path of anti-Semitism.
Hmm.
But let's go back in time because I thought anti-Semitism, right-wing anti-Semitism, was a thing of the past. It was something that happened 80 years ago when the extermination of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust took place. But let's be clear, Josiah. Was right wing anti Semitism the cause behind the Holocaust?
Yes, it was the cause behind the Holocaust because of course, the Nazi Party, which came to power in Germany, was a fascist party. They had very fascist and right-wing anti-Semitic views of the Jewish people, and of course that's what led them to carry out the Holocaust. I think to take a step back though, just to sort of frame this issue a little bit for everyone, part of why this issue is so complicated for people to wrap their head around, is right-wing anti-Semitism a new problem or an old problem, is because people often assume that left-wing anti-Semitism and right-wing anti-Semitism cannot exist at the same time. They assume that there's some sort of rotation of the two, that there's a cyclical pattern between the two, either or, not both at the same time. And the reality is actually quite different. It's pretty normal, in fact, for left-wing and right-wing anti-Semitism to exist at the same time. For many centuries, anti-Semitism was a little bit simpler in the respect that it was of a largely religious nature. It was based on, unfortunately, a large number of Christian tropes about the Jewish people. And it was really not until I think after the Enlightenment that you saw sort of the evolution of different forms of anti-Semitism and the variety of different forms of anti-Semitism begin to emerge so rapidly and grow so rapidly. But very shortly after that, all of a sudden you had various social theories develop, which would come at the issue of anti-Semitism from very different directions. So you had the nihilists, for example, arguing that the Jews were responsible for the crushing weight of moralism, ironically responsible for the birth of Christianity, which was holding the world back. You had, of course, social Darwinism and race theory. You had the fascists arguing that the Jews were socialist or communist, and then on the flip side, you had the socialists or communists arguing that the Jews were capitalists. And what this demonstrates is that throughout a lot of the history that led up to the Holocaust, you had not just right wing or just left wing anti-Semitism. You had both at the same time, even though they were inherently contradictory. It was almost like this weird, tragic hobby that everyone could participate in at the same time, hating the Jewish people, regardless of your background. It was almost a universal phenomenon. And that's leading up to and since the Holocaust, much more descriptive of the way that anti Semitism fits into society. I think that it's pretty rare that you have just right wing or just left wing anti Semitism. You usually have both. And I would argue that that's really the case, that it might seem like right wing anti Semitism is a relatively new phenomenon, but it's not. I mean, it's been around for many, many years, and it's always existed, even if we've paid more attention to left wing anti Semitism in recent years.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I hope people, I'm sure you recognize what Josiah was getting at, that capitalists have hated Jews in certain circumstances because Jews are socialists. Socialists have hated Jews in some circumstances in history because they were capitalists. So they can't win. So I guess the common denominator here is not who hates them and why. It's just that people seem to just hate Jews, and that's that's what we're gonna be talking about today. I was even reading a book recently about the Mongols, and the last episode, the last chapter of the book, taught me something I never knew, that back in the day in Europe, after the Mongols kind of disappeared, people started hating Jews and blaming the Jews for what the Mongols had done to
Mm,
Europe. It's a really weird thing. I'll put it in the notes the name of the book. It's a very, I think it's Susan Wells, the name of the author. She's a very reputable historian who talks about how even hatred of, or like fear of the Mongols led to anti-Semitism in Europe, in medieval Europe. So, anyways,
that's wild.
uh, yeah, it seems like what the extreme left and the extreme right, they don't agree on anything. They agree on one thing: they seem to use Jews as scapegoats. So people today, though, they are less aware of right wing anti Semitism. I think if you ask people, name one instance of anti Semitism in the last year, the first thing that comes to my mind is in Australia, right after October 7, crowds of people chanting gas
Mm.
the Jews in 2024 or 2023. Like in this century, people are saying this out loud in a Western country, right? In Australia. Uh, people might accuse Jewish people of being too successful, being too rich, and anti-Zionism is behind it is also an extreme version of progressivism. I know we're saying a lot of words, but Josiah, let me take it back to you. Why do you think all of this is happening?
It's a really good question. So, Sebastian, you're right. The examples that you just listed are examples that we traditionally would associate with left wing anti-Semitism, less so right wing anti-Semitism, and they are also the ones that happen to be, I think, more commonly known or in the headlines fairly often. Another example that just happened very recently was, of course, the shooting in Washington D.C. of two Israeli diplomats or employees of the Israeli embassy in Washington D.C. There's a lot that still needs to be reported, I think, on the details of that attack, what people know for sure, and what they'll be able to prove in court when he eventually goes to trial. But one thing that does seem to be out there and fairly commonly reported at this point was that the individual who did so had a fairly strong left wing background. So that's one reason I think why a lot of people are more familiar is just because the headlines tend to follow the left wing anti Semitic acts or protests more than they do right wing anti Semitism. But there is, I
Yeah,
think, more
I
to
saw a
it.
picture. Sorry, I saw a picture of him today. The picture that surfaced of him at a protest. It was like an economic protest. It was like a socialist, social justice, progressive, uh, economic justice protest, and he's right there holding a sign that had
Yeah.
nothing to do about Israel, but just something about uh, social justice. So we'll probably find that picture and put it right here. But sorry, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
Keep going.
No, no, that's right. I mean, these are the types of stories that people I think are more familiar with, and part of why is because they're in the news. It's less commonly going to be reported the kinds of right-wing anti-Semitism that exists today, and we'll get to some of those examples in a moment. But they're just not going to make the headlines as often as some of the other end of the spectrum in terms of how anti-Semitism presents itself. Something else I did want to mention briefly as well is that after the Holocaust, I think there's a serious reckoning that took place. And a lot of the world adopted the slogan, never again. That meant different things to different people. For some people, that meant the Holocaust would not happen again. For other people, they co opted that phrase and they used it to mean, never again to fascism or that kind of thing. And it was really across the world, both in terms of the political realm, but also the church. Everyone sort of took a hard look at themselves and said, "Yeah, this can't happen again, and we have to fix or punish the forms of evil that led to the Holocaust." So what that meant was that a lot of right wing anti-Semitism, for a while, it sort of went underground. It continued to exist, but it was far less socially acceptable. There was a remarkable amount of social and peer pressure not to be a Nazi. That's the worst thing that you could be. People were, I think, also immediately after the Holocaust very aware of the consequences of this kind of anti-Semitism. They were far less tolerant of it. You also saw in the decades following the Holocaust that the world was also becoming more aware of other issues that it wanted to address and sort of lumped into the same category. Things like racism, the civil rights movement emerging in the US in the 50s and 60s. You had a lot of different reasons, I think, why right wing anti Semitism had to be more subtle, because if it didn't, it was going to attract a lot of attention, a lot of negative attention, and people were going to be much, I think, quicker to reject it. Until very recently, right wing anti Semitism, what that means is that it sort of lived on the margins, on the periphery, or again, sort of underground. It wasn't something that really popped its head up very often. Left wing anti Semitism did stay above ground. And part of why, I think, is that it found a way to remain more socially acceptable. And, we could argue back and forth for days. I feel like, how did they do that? how how did left-wing anti-Semites find a way to make it their views socially acceptable? But for better or worse, like they did. And it became something that was ingrained more into the mainstream over time, whether that's different circles of the so-called elites in America, or within different institutions like very elite media programs or higher education institutions, whatever it may be. You do find that over time they manage to make it socially acceptable. That it was okay to say things like, it's not anti-Semitism, it's just anti-Zionism, or it's not about the Jews, it's just about Israel, or whatever it may be. And right-wing anti-Semitism just never managed to make itself that broadly appealing or socially acceptable. So now that it's back in full force, I think people are a little bit surprised because it's always been there. They're just not used to it being so public, so vocal, and so loud about the viewpoints that it espouses.
Yeah, one of the things I started learning when I studied political science in college is that the political spectrum sometimes is not a line; it's like a circle. And if you go far enough in the left, far enough in the right, you kind of start meeting each other in a lot of commonalities. But I want to park for a second. Let's go down a little bunny trail.
Mm,
If I hear you right, what you're saying is like, because of Nazism is bad, Nazism was terrible, that became unacceptable to be an anti-Semite on the right, and the brand of the Nazis got a really bad rep after World War II. But I wonder if we can go here for a second. Russia or the USSR was an ally of the United Kingdom and the United States during World War II. And
mhm.
after that, anti-Semitism in Russia, in the USSR, was prevalent. Was Can you just go there for a second? Like, so the Nazis disappeared, so that brand of anti-Semitism disappeared. But for a second, in the USSR, in the Soviet Union, there was still anti-Semitism on the left.
Yeah, absolutely there was. Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, you had this weird dichotomy leading up to and even shortly after the Holocaust of people splitting into one of two camps that would seem to be contradictory, but were finding common ground around this issue of how they felt about the Jewish people. You people on the right who thought that they were socialist or communist. You people on the left who, especially if they hailed from the far left, let's call it socialist or communist backgrounds, would think of the Jews as capitalist or as far right extremist or whatever. So it was really quite interesting that the Jews found themselves caught in the middle. And unfortunately, I think today you're seeing a lot of parallels of that, that they still find themselves caught in the middle between the extremists on both the left and the right who find common ground in their hate for the Jewish people.
Yeah, like we said at the introduction, this is a big subject, and we'll probably get there one day. But it's so interesting to think that a lot of the Jews who started going to Israel as pioneers in the late 1800s, early 1900s, before World War II, there were people who were kind of on the left, or like very much on the left, right?
Yeah.
Very communal type of living, very socialist later on, and but they were not accepted in their own for instance, in the Soviet Union, there was anti-Semitism there too. Just look up the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is Soviet anti-Jewish propaganda. So thank you for that, Josiah. We have established that after the Nazis, we learn about the horrors of World War II, Nazi anti-Semitism, right wing anti-Semitism kind of disappeared, but it seems right now that right wing anti-Semitism is increasing again, as I have been saying. So the question is, I'd like to ask you. Last time when we recorded, I asked you to be a prophet. Now I'm asking you to say, is anti Semitism on the right wing actually increasing, or are we just paying more attention to it?
Both. Both. I, it depends in part on how you think about the definition of anti-Semitism. If you mean
Oh, yeah, let's
a
define it.
specific, yeah, I mean, so maybe let's break this down just briefly. What is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism, in broad terms, is a particular view of the Jewish people, especially a hateful one that is expressed against Jewish people, Jewish institutions, is something that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance would also include. So it's not just, you know, yelling slurs at a Jewish people. It could also mean spraying graffiti on a Jewish synagogue. That's also a form of anti-Semitism. Now, what I think, to answer your question, Sebastian, is it increasing or are we just paying more attention to it? I think it depends in part on whether you mean the attitude or the expression of it, because I would argue the attitude has always existed. People have always said in secret things that you couldn't necessarily say out loud about the Jewish people. But it does seem like today people are more aware of it, maybe paying more attention to it, in part because the not just the attitude, but the expression of it does seem to be increasing a little bit. And I think in the next few episodes, we'll get into more specifics, more details, maybe a little bit of data on the subject. But definitely specific acts of anti Semitism, whether that's things that you're seeing on social media or physical acts of intimidation or vandalism, whatever it may be, it has increased. So it's both an increase of attention to, and I think also an increase in the specific behaviors that give away or portray these anti-Semitic mindsets.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to get into details later, but let's think about some big categories. What are some things that people might say? What are some examples of anti Semitism on the right?
Yeah, I think there's a couple big buckets that we'll definitely spend some time in again in the next few episodes unpacking in a little bit more detail. But just to give people a little bit of a taste for what are some of the types of issues that have been cropping up recently, and we have to be, I would argue, more aware of and more careful about. Things like Holocaust denial is a great example. So this basically means denying either the facts about the Holocaust, denying that it happened, or denying how bad it was, the severity of it, or especially I think especially evil cases, denying the truth about the morality or lack thereof of the Holocaust. So people who take the microphone and will try to do things like justify or even glorify the events of the Holocaust, saying it was a good thing. Those are all forms of Holocaust denial or distortion. And it's becoming increasingly common. I think it makes a lot of sense if you're looking at the far right of the political spectrum and the history that it has, the connection to major events like the Holocaust, which horrified the world and led most of the world to condemn immediately anyone who claims the title of Nazi or things like that. Then it makes sense in order to be allowed to sort of come out of hiding and no longer have to operate in secret. If you want to have any sort of social capital or public goodwill, the far right would have to whitewash the events of the Holocaust. They would have to either deny that it happened in the first place, or they would have to find a way to trick people into thinking that it wasn't a bad thing. Maybe it was even a good thing. So that really, I think, just makes a ton of sense why you're seeing something like Holocaust denial happen more frequently as people are trying to re enter the mainstream, make right wing anti Semitism more socially acceptable. In order to do that, you have to really sort of deny or reframe the consequences of right wing anti Semitism as it was experienced during the Holocaust. The second thing that I think you're seeing a lot of is conspiracy theories. And again, we don't have time to unpack in detail all of the different conspiracy theories that have been coming up. I think we'll probably spend an entire episode talking about this in the next few weeks, but there's a lot. There's a lot of different conspiracy theories that have been coming out recently that are not necessarily unique even to right-wing anti-Semitism. Again, it's interesting that you can see this on both the left and right, some commonalities in some of these conspiracy theories, but a few that definitely stand out that you're going to hear a lot on different podcasts or different influencers on the social media. There's, a lot of people just using the platform they have to say some things that are honestly pretty wild and crazy. Again, a few examples of this would be things like the Jews are, ruling the world with their money, or they control all of the media, they control the government. There's a global cabal of Satanists that is run by the Jews. There's global pedophilia rings, or Israel controls the United States. It pulls strings. The United States is not independent. It does whatever Israel wants, which is just not true. I think you can watch some of our recent episodes to hear more about how we don't always agree with Israel. Our foreign policies don't always align. We don't always do what they want, and vice versa. But there's some pretty wild things that people actually believe and are actually saying publicly right now. Things like the Jews are greedy, they are warmongering, even bloodthirsty. And well, I think what's especially unfortunate is you've also got this interesting conspiracy theory recently emerging about free speech, where anyone who suggests that anti Semitic speech should be challenged, not even outlawed, but just that people should speak up against it as morally reprehensible. Some people would argue that's just proof that the Jews control speech and information, even how individuals are allowed to think or speak. So it's it's really unfortunate the way that it's kind of just this weird, I don't even know how to describe it, contagion. It's like it touches almost every issue you can think about. Someone is going to have had the thought that the Jews must be controlling this, whatever problem exists in society. They must be the ones behind it. There must be some giant conspiracy. This must be intentional or planned to hurt me. And it's a big deal. I mean, we really have to wrestle with the fact that this isn't going anywhere. It's only growing very quickly. Why is this happening? And what are we going to do about it?
Wow, yeah, so much to say about that. It's like you said. The last thing you were saying is that this is sickness. This is an obsession, and for Christians, this is what I want to invite us to think about. How is it that people always find a way to blame the Jews for all their problems? Jews are 1% of the world. The Jewish state is one tiny little state the size of New Jersey, the size of El Salvador, and there is surrounded by like 30 Muslim Arab countries, and there are also probably like not hundreds, but like dozen of other Christian countries. Just look at any country that has a cross on its flag, that pretty much has Christian heritage behind it. But somehow the Jews are if the Jews control the media, why is there so much hatred for Israel in the media? Why,
Yeah,
if the
it
Jews
doesn't
control,
make sense usually. Most of it sounds super illogical when you hear it, but it's a thing.
like the United Nations, like if the Jews control the world, then why is the United Nations obsessed condemning Israel over the last 20 years, and they never condemn Syria, Venezuela, Iran, all these other countries? So it doesn't make sense once you follow it logically. For Christians, I want to say one more thing. Anti-Semitism needs to be thought. I want to say this hot take. Okay, ready for this? Please check me on this. I think
Sebastian's
for
hot take. Here we go.
Christians, I think for Christians, hating any person that carries the image of God, like all people do, it's a sin, right? Hailing black people, hating Asian people, Hispanic people, it's just sinful and discriminatory because you're hating somebody that shares the image of God, like you do. But I want to
Hmm.
say this: I think anti-Semitism is especially egregious sin because, as I can think of right now, hate, arrogance against the Jewish people is the only type of hatred that is pointed out in the Bible against other group of people. I'm trying to refer to Romans. The Bible explicitly commands Christians do not be arrogant because they are the roots, you're the branches, and it's not the branches that support the roots, it's the roots that support the branches. So what I want to submit, I think, it's especially egregious sin for Christians to start following anti-Semitic theories because the Bible literally tells us to not grow arrogance. I think behind Christian anti-Semitism there is envy, and there is envy about like who's the real chosen people. You're not chosen. We're chosen now. The church is bigger now than the synagogue. So there is this little brother envy in the chronology of redemption history that Christians embrace, of have embraced in the past, in the present too. And I think it's especially egregious because the Bible literally tells us do not be arrogant towards our Jewish roots. Your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, Sebastian, it's not like this is the only form of hate that the Bible calls out, but it does. The fact that it does call it out, I think, is interesting because I don't think there's any accidents in the Bible. I think both the people writing scripture, Paul especially, but God, who we believe inspired the words of the Bible, they knew that this was going to be something that would be a problem that the church was going to have to address, was already having to address in the first century, but would have to continue to address this temptation to create these sharp divides between Jews and Gentiles or Jews and early Christians, where there really shouldn't have been. There should have been a deep sense of respect between the two. And I think if it's in there, it's in there for a reason, and we do have to consider carefully what do those words mean in Romans when they call us to not be arrogant towards the Jewish people as Christians.
Yeah, and I think another part of this, in the conservative side and the right wing anti-Semitism, I think it's idolatry of country versus fidelity to God's people. Once again, the Bible calls you to be a Christian. Your biggest allegiance is to the Lord, to the kingdom of God, and the Bible says that the Jewish people are the apple of His eyes. That they will always be a nation before Him. Jeremiah 31. So if you try to say, well, I'm an America first person, and that's fine. What is not fine is to start buying into anti-Semitic conspiracies. Idolatry of your country versus fidelity to God's people is something that Christians should consider. But it seems, Josiah, like a lot of this stuff is coming from guys, from men. And I want to give a quick shout out to our colleague Dominique from our sister organization, the Philos Projects, our colleagues over there, who she will be joining us soon here in one of our episodes. She has these words about the manosphere. She refers to like these men who are all
Yeah.
saying these things. She calls the manosphere, and she also calls them brats and chats. But that's her thing. I'll let her explain that when she comes on the podcast. There are a lot of men out there, but also a few women. And also, there's a lot of racial diversity than you expect. This is not just white nationalism behind it. There's religious diversity. So you see anti-Semitism from Christians, from atheists, agnostics, Muslims. Um, the
Yeah.
loudest voices right now seem to be influencers, podcast hosts, entertainers, but they share some things in common. They're people who are wanting to like challenge the mainstream. They're like, oh, we know the truth, we know what's going on, those people are lying to you. So because they earn people's trust in certain areas, then they start spitting anti-Semitic theories. People start buying into that. They're also referred to themselves as like noticers, people who are like, oh, I'm just asking questions, I'm asking questions, and I'm noticing this, I'm noticing that. So this is similar to those on the far left who refer to themselves as woke. Again, my friend Dominique has, I heard her say the term, the what is it, right wing woke, conservative woke. There is also a version of this on the right, right?
Yeah, I mean, something that's popped up recently, a term that you're seeing fly around the internet right now is, woke right,
Woke right.
essentially.
That's what I was trying to get to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. Like I said, there is a lot of diversity. It seems to be celebrity. So, for many centuries, you said it earlier, anti Semitism was promoted by Christians as a religious issue. Think of the Inquisition, think of the Middle Ages. Is that still a problem? Is that still a problem for Christians today?
It is. And I appreciate the question, Sebastian, because I think what you just laid out very well is that the point we've been trying to make is that anti-Semitism, it's not isolated to one end of the spectrum or the other, but conservatives need to take a really hard look at the conservative side of the spectrum because it is popping up more frequently on that side of the aisle. And even within the conservative camp, I think it is a semi universal issue. Of course, it's popping up among agnostics, atheists, Muslims. But what that shouldn't do, that recognition, which is important of just how widespread the problem of anti-Semitism is, should not prevent us from looking inward at ourselves and asking ourselves, are we part of the problem? And I think the Christians do need to think about the role that Christianity historically has played in creating and disseminating various anti-Semitic tropes, some of which are still in use today. And that doesn't mean that every person is guilty of using one, or that we necessarily need to accept the blame for the fact that these tropes exist. But we do have to think carefully about where did these originate. Unfortunately, they originated in Christianity, which means that I do think we have a responsibility to reject them as not being a part of faithful Christianity or Orthodox Christianity. Now, some examples of what this might look like are things like blood libel. Part of the reason why people on the right wing today can make the argument that the Jewish people are bloodthirsty, that they're warmongering, they just want more and more war, blood, death, and destruction, is because Christians came up with this idea in the medieval period that the Jewish people liked to consume the blood of young Christian children, that they were essentially, an evil satanic vampire race, more or less. That, I mean, you wouldn't have some of the conspiracy theories on the right wing today that we do if it weren't for the role that the church historically has played in coming up with some of these ideas, unfortunately. Another example would be deicide, the charge basically that the Jewish people are guilty of the murder of God because it accuses the Jewish people of murdering Jesus, who is the Son of God. And if they did that, then that must mean that they're guilty of murdering God himself. And if you can murder God, you can do anything. So there's no redeeming the Jewish people. They're just lost, condemned for eternity because of that. A lot of issues with that, I think. I mean, the charge of deicide is pretty irrational in many ways because it wasn't the Jewish people that killed Jesus. It was the Romans. Yes, there was a small group of Jewish people who advocated for Pilate to sentence Jesus to death, but they were not representative of the Jewish community at large necessarily. Jesus was a Jewish person. His followers were Jewish disciples of himself. So to
Yeah.
to condemn the entire Jewish race for the death of Jesus when he himself was Jewish as were his followers, is just irrational. It doesn't make any sense. But that charge has sustained itself for many centuries. People will still believe that, and people will still use that as a reason to argue that some of these conspiracy theories are true, or that maybe the Holocaust was a good thing. Maybe they deserved it, the Jewish people, because of what they did to Jesus, supposedly. So again,
Yeah.
I just think Christians need to, we don't have to accept blame for coming up with these things necessarily, but we need to be very clear that we reject them and that they do not represent, they're very harmful to Jewish Christian relations, first of all, and they don't represent faithful or Orthodox Christianity, and therefore we reject them outright.
Yeah, this issue of the side is a great way to study why anti-Semitism is so infectious. The deicide, right? The homicide of the deity of Christ. So even if you apply that logically, like you hate Jews because the Jews killed Christ, what about the Romans? So the Romans were the ones who actually executed him and condemned him to
Mhm.
death, and all of that. And you don't see anti-Italian movements among Christians, right? Like
Yeah.
imagine people around the world like, oh, I don't need pasta. Why? Because I'm a Christian and I don't. And the Romans killed Jesus, and the Italians are the descendants of the Romans. So like you don't see that. You do not see people hating Italians because of the Christ's crucifixion, but you do see people who accuse the Jews, and that shows the issue that it's not about what they did or what they didn't do or whatever. It's because people just fall for this hatred. It's a spiritual thing, I think. People just want to blame the Jews. Let me throw something to you.
Mm.
I've been operating with a definition of anti-Semitism as is known in the international definition of anti-Semitism, which is the 3 Ds. And I want to give this to our audience as a tool. The 3 Ds of anti-Semitism are demonization of the Jewish people, delegitimization of the Jewish people, and double standards. What I just described here was a double standard. You hold the Jews to one standard, you don't hold the Romans and their descendants to a different standard. So I think if people, I just want to give this as a tool to people. This is a great way to study. A double standard is always an example of anti-Semitism toward the Jewish people. What do you think of that definition? Is that helpful?
I think it's a really great way to sort of visualize the different categories of anti-Semitism. And if you were to pick one that I think unfortunately represents a lot of what we're seeing right now on the right wing of American politics or society, it would be demonization, really. The on the left wing for a while, it's been more so like the delegitimization issue, especially when it comes to the state of Israel, anti-Zionism and its relationship to anti-Semitism. That category is what you would probably most commonly associate with left-wing anti-Semitism most recently. But if you're taking a look at what's most prevalent on the right wing, I think demonization is where a lot of those examples are going to fall into, whether it's arguing that they deserved the Holocaust or arguing that they are the ones behind all of these conspiracy theories and that there's something supernaturally evil about the Jews, that they're a bunch of Satanists or something like that. I mean, that's classic definition of demonization of another people group. So I think that is something that on the right wing, people really got to be careful about in terms of thinking about, well, what are we doing to or saying about the Jewish people? Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's demonizing the Jewish people right now.
Yeah. Well, we started our podcast talking about the trend that we're noticing right now, the trend of anti-Semitism on the right wing. We talk about some key examples like Jews controlling the media, controlling the United States, controlling the world with their money. So let's finish our podcast now talking about the causes. Where is this
Yeah.
coming from, and why is it becoming more socially acceptable? Why are people going on podcasts on the world to see saying anti-Semitic things?
Yeah, if only we had the answer to that question, then maybe we could prevent all of these crazy things from happening and from the different very contentious things being said or hurtful things being said. Maybe we could prevent all of pain and hurt, but I'm not sure it's quite that simple. There are, I think, a lot of interesting related and not all of them solely responsible, but connected to this trend of right wing anti-Semitism, different social trends. So, for example, you have things like the polarization within society writ large. That's a big deal because historically, if you take a look at what happens to most societies, or if you look at the Jewish experience in the diaspora throughout that period of Jewish history, much of the experience was you arrive in a new place, things were okay for a little while if you're lucky. And then the minute something starts to go wrong and the economy weakens or political divides emerge, fractures emerge, and people start to separate into, their two sides of whatever political aisle exists in that country. The polarization deepens, the finger pointing, the blaming starts to happen. Inevitably, what eventually happens is that the Jews wind up being the scapegoats, that they are the ones who are blamed for whatever's wrong, and then they were expelled from that society, and then they had to move on. That, in a nutshell, defines, unfortunately, a lot of the Jewish history during the diaspora. And that's sort of happening in the United States right now. There's a lot of social distrust. There's a lot of polarization, politically speaking, a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame, no real capacity, it would seem, for constructive dialogue. People are scared and mistrustful of each other, and they want someone to blame because that's the easiest way to explain the things that scare people right now. And unfortunately, that means that the Jews wind up getting caught and blamed for a lot of those issues, unfortunately. So that's definitely one thing that I think is part of what's going on here. But again, that's really, I I think, only one part. If you want to take a look at what you mentioned as well, some of the different alternative media developing that's helping to make this more socially acceptable, why do we take as gospel truth what someone says on a podcast? And I appreciate the listeners of this podcast, but I hope no one's listening to this podcast and just accepting as gospel truth every single word that comes out of our mouths. Like, you should be checking to see if what we say is true. You should be thinking critically, reading sources, verifying the things that you hear. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't do that. And I think part of that is because of lived experience recently. So, Sebastian, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from my vantage point, one of the things that happened was during the pandemic in 2020, a lot of people were already sort of mistrustful of different media sources, or they had a preferred media source that they trusted over others. But during the pandemic, there was so much confusion and chaos and questions about, are people really telling us the truth? Are they hiding something from us? Is there a big secret that we don't know about? I mean, where did COVID come from? Is the vaccine safe? Who knows really? Who has the answers, and are they giving them to us? And in the process, I think it sort of expedited this mistrust in media, or accelerated the growth of that problem, especially in younger people. And then what wound up happening is that you would go to these people, like you use the term that has described a lot of them as sort of the noticers, the people who are smart enough to ask questions and to tell you the truth when everyone else is keeping a big secret from you, or that kind of thing. Trust in those kinds of alternative media outlets or influencers grew as a result of the mistakes I think were made by traditional large mainstream media institutions, especially during the pandemic. And when what you're left with is the alternative media outlets, all of a sudden you do have people who have a massive platform that they didn't a few years ago, and they can amplify messages that are more fringe and, quite frankly, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, more dangerous. So there's that going on. I'd be curious. I mean, I have more ideas about what's causing this, but I'd be curious, Sebastian, for your reaction to that. Is that just me, or do you feel like there's something there that might be going on?
No, totally. And I think a lot of people have been pointing this out that, for instance, science, especially in the modern world, postmodern world, scientism is the religion of a lot of people, elevating scientists to the highest level. And in a lot of ways, when we go to college, well, I went to a secular college, you went to a Christian college.
Mm.
In my secular college, we're all like, um, what do you call it? We're all programmed to worship science and to just is the highest form of and theology used to be the queen of the sciences in medieval universities. When universities started, people studied theology first before they study anything else, because you need to have the
Right.
right understanding of God before you do anything else. Anyways, um, with the whole COVID thing, a lot of people mistrusting the vaccine and uh, man, I don't know if you want to go down this road, but like even recently, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, he said publicly, he said like I was pressured by the United States government to what is the word, to not promote. What's the opposite of promoting? Sorry, they shouldn't put me on a podcast. To
Um,
suppress, that's the word I
so,
was looking
yeah.
for, to
Okay.
suppress content that kind of questioned stuff about the vaccine and where the virus came from. And yeah, he was pressured with the United States government to do that. So people, that causes a lot of mistrust. That causes a lot of people to question, to can we trust scientists? Look at our director of the director of our health department today, RFK Jr. uh, not even going to get into that, but he is a person who has risen to this very prominent post because he people don't trust the traditional science anymore. They don't trust traditional medicine, and people like him are gaining ground in that platform. So you definitely, and I think all of our listeners will confirm this. So please let us in the comments, what are some other ways that you have noticed how appeal to authority doesn't work anymore, appeal to experts doesn't work anymore, and people are just mistrusting of authorities in general.
Yeah. That's a really good point, Sebastian. That I think the appeal to authority or expertise has weakened significantly. You're definitely seeing that in recent events as well, when there's a debate about what's happening in Israel or the war in Gaza, for example. It's really interesting how there's this growing divide, I think. Some people who prefer to hear from the experts, so-called experts, and then people who just want to hear the average person's opinion. They would rather hear what someone who hasn't studied the conflict thinks than a journalist's perspective. They would rather hear a comedian instead, for example, give their opinion on whether there's a genocide happening in Gaza. It's really fascinating. I think it's a fascinating social phenomenon. It can be a bit dangerous, which is disconcerting. But as someone who is a political science major in college, I also think it's fascinating, the the different ways that we get to this point where people are consuming information in new ways than they had previously, and how it's shaping their views. Just two more things I wanted to mention briefly as potential factors at play here in encouraging this rise of right-wing anti-Semitism. You have, I think, a growth of both populism and isolationism, which are both somewhat related to what's happening right now. So populism is basically a political framework. And I'm just going to define this roughly for the sake of describing its relationship to anti-Semitism. It's a political framework that has a lot to do with airing grievances and trying to address and resolve grievances towards the elite. So it's much more of a working middle class political framework than it is one that includes members of the elite. It is, I would say, more antagonistic towards the elites, of course. And to be fair, I mean, this is not necessarily a critique of populism writ large, because there are in many cases some valid grievances which do need to be addressed and have to be thought about very carefully and then handled. But the the downside to populism as it relates to anti-Semitism is that it tends to lump the Jewish people in with the elites. And so as more and more people become convinced that the 1% are out to get us, and the working class has to take back what's theirs, and they have to challenge the elites for their rights or whatever it may be, the Jewish people become associated with that fight, but on the other side of that fight. They're part of the problem. They're the enemy as these battle lines are drawn in American politics, unfortunately. So that has something to do with it as well, I think. And then lastly, like I said, isolationism. In many cases, one of the reasons why people think that Israel is warmongering or whatever is because they falsely attribute the Bush era policy or foreign policy that is becoming increasingly less accepted or less popular. They falsely attribute that to Israel. They argue that the only reason the U.S. invaded Iraq and Afghanistan is because Israel, and that's kind of crazy. I mean,
That's so crazy.
there's one of two ways you get there. Either you argue that Israel's responsible for 9/11 because that's really what prompted the invasion of Afghanistan.
And a
Maybe
lot of people believe that.
people do. People do. I,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not at all true, but some
Yeah.
people really do believe that. Or people believe that Israel didn't commit the acts of terrorism on 9/11, but that they were just pulling the strings, that Bush was nothing but a puppet who only did what Israel told him after 9/11. And I just don't think that's true. That's just not faithful to the facts. If you know the facts, know the history, then it's fair for the isolationist camp to argue that serious mistakes in American foreign policy were made during those years. And sure, there's a lot that we need to discuss and debrief and decide if that was right or wrong, and what American foreign policy should be moving forward. But to argue that the only reason that it happened is because Israel made it so is to avoid any accountability or responsibility for America's foreign policy. It's our foreign policy, not Israel's. And if there's something wrong with it, then America needs to be the one to take accountability for it and make corrections if we decide that's necessary. So I have a lot to say on that subject. I do find it particularly annoying that Israel is blamed for something like 9/11 because I think that distracts blame from the people who really were responsible for it. But I do think both of those social political phenomena of the rise of populism and isolationism are at work behind the scenes. There's this weird combination of different trends right now that are working together, I think, to create some of these more public forms of anti-Semitism on the right.
Yeah, that's one more example of how people who hate Jews will find any reason to blame them for anything. Literally, a terrorist attack done by extreme Islamists, most of them from Saudi Arabia, and somehow people find a way to blame Israel for that. But just as we just spent almost an hour talking about anti-Semitism, and I wanted to make a personal confession here. I've said this publicly many times. I've written about this. I share this when I share my story. In our first episode here, I shared my story of how I used to hate Israel, and I also not only used to hate Israel, I also became started going down the road of anti-Semitism
Mm,
as a Christian, because I still called myself a Christian, even though I was walking away from the faith. I became very leftist. I became very socialist in college, and I remember going to Israel. We went to the Beersheba, and there's some communities there that the government wants to incentivize them to live in the desert because Israel is mostly desert. So they're trying to give people incentives to move to the desert. And I remember this community, they're living there, they're building this community in the desert. And I genuinely went up to this guy and I asked him, wait, why do you want to live here? This is terrible living. You're a Jew. You could be working in Wall Street. You could be working in the media in Hollywood. Like, you're such a smart person. Why are you living here? You're a Jewish guy. You don't have to do this. And the guy like insulted me in Hebrew. Later I learned, and asked the guy like, what's going on with this guy? I didn't realize what I had done in that moment. But after my
mm,
trip, I came home and I realized, oh man, what is it about me that I only had a category for Jewish people as successful bankers in Wall Street or whatever?
yeah.
I didn't realize that I had anti-Semitic views, and that led me to a path to start healing. Another way that I saw anti-Semitism in my life is, and this happens a lot in Spanish countries, but we inherit a lot of anti-Semitism from the classic. My country was discovered 6 months after the Jews were kicked out of Spain by the Spanish crown. So the
Mm,
Spanish people had a lot of anti Semitism in their views. And even the words that we say, for instance, in Colombia, sometimes when people say to pay the rent or to charge rent, they say la judía. La judía is the rent because they had this image of Jewish people as rent collectors. Or like when somebody wrongs you, you would say, oh, this person Jewed me, me hizo la judía. They did the Jewish thing to me. So, anyways, I'm saying all this to say that I had to be healed from it, and the Lord rescued me from that. I had to repent and heal from these anti-Semitic views that I had myself. And I think I thought about this, and I wanted to communicate this in one thought to our people. I started mistrusting Jewish people, and I think I'm seeing that on the right wing right now. People who mistrust the government, especially coming out of the last administration, COVID, all of this, and they think that mistrusting the system, asking questions, makes them smarter, but is leading them towards anti-Semitism because when our mistrust turns people into enemies and scapegoats, we're no longer asking questions anymore. We're breaking commandments. Let me say that again. When you start asking questions, mistrusting people, you're not asking questions anymore. You are breaking commandments now. You're not loving your neighbor as yourself. You're not loving God. You're not loving God's people. And you're being arrogant towards the roots, which, again, the Bible commands us to not be arrogant. So, I just wanted to take a moment to publicly recognize that even I became a victim of anti-Semitism. Thank God I've been healed from that. And I want to encourage people with the book of Thessalonians, first book of Thessalonians 5:21, which the book of Thessalonians, in a way, is about a conspiracy theory. There were some people in Thessalonica who were saying that Jesus was coming back now. So people stopped working, they started selling their properties, they started living like because Jesus could come any moment. So Paul is writing to them to correct them. And he says, he's talking about prophecies, and he says in First Thessalonians 5:21, talking about prophecy, he says, do not treat prophecies with contempt, but test them all and hold on to what is good. So this is my encouragement to people. If you see a friend of yours who is conservative, who's on the right, and they start saying anti-Semitic things, they start going down that evil road, you should encourage them to test everything, but hold on to what is good. They should have discernment, not hatred towards the Jewish people. So I just wanted to take a moment to recognize my own past in this area and also to encourage people biblically. What do you say to that?
I appreciate you sharing that, Sebastian. I think it's admirable and good. I think that people are able to see what it looks like to accept some personal responsibility against to look inward. Because I think the nature of anti-Semitism, especially when you're viewing it through the political lens that we have today, it's much easier to point at the other person on the other side of the political aisle and say, that's something that you struggle with. That's not something that I struggle with. That's your problem, not mine. I'm on the right side of this. I couldn't be anti-Semitic or something like that. And the reality is, I think it's an issue that's just permeated so widely and deep throughout society that sometimes people don't even know when they're engaging with ideas or conspiracy theories or whatnot that might have a sinister or anti-Semitic element to it. So that humility and willingness to take a step back and just engage in some reflection about, what do I believe? What does the Bible say that I should believe? I mean, it's a great example that you've just given us. So I appreciate you sharing that story.
Well, thank you for doing the research, for bringing this subject. As again, to our listeners, this is just the beginning of this conversation. We're going to have a lot more episodes talking about anti-Semitic conspiracies, Holocaust denial, and we're going to be talking about these things in the future. So thank you for watching. I'm going to invite you to share this, like this. Thank you to our production team, Josh, Avery, and Lindsay, and Josiah. I hope that by the time people are watching this, you are home enjoying your newborn. I'll let you give us the final word here. Take us away.
Nope. From your lips to God's ears. Let's hope. Yeah, appreciate it, Sebastian.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.